Hello, everyone. A little bit of a different face than I think everyone's used to. Welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jeff Mazziata. I am not the usual host for Getting to Know Japan. Of course, Amani Kid is our usual host. She's here with us actually today as well. She was kind enough to let me step in as the moderator today to appease my nerdy dreams of hosting something to do with pro wrestling. So I want to say thank you to Amani for that before we get started. But today we're joined by Dr. Mike Bosack, who'll be presenting on Off the Top Rope in Nagatacho, Pro Wrestling, and Japanese Politics. Dr. Bosack is the Special Advisor for Government Relations at the Yokosuka Council on Asia Pacific Studies. I think we know that organization. He previously served in the Japanese government as a Mansfield Fellow as well. And I just want to mention a kind reminder to everyone to please refrain from turning on your microphones during the duration of today's recording and presentation. We are recording this. It will be also up on our YouTube for folks to check out later at their leisure. So that being said, I want to hand things over to our presenter today, Dr. Bosack. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And thank you to everybody who's joining today, whether it's good morning to you or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Just very happy to be talking about this subject. Not a subject that I thought 10 years ago I'd be presenting on. I wasn't necessarily a huge pro wrestling fan growing up. Certainly interested in Japanese politics and Northeast Asian security. And what I didn't realize was how much all of this overlapped. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll understand why I'm so interested in it now, and maybe it'll be something that piques your interest even more in it as you go along. So what I'd like to do is just pull up the slides here. We'll start with a short presentation, and then we'll open up for Q&A afterwards. So as I mentioned, I was a casual observer, and I casually aware of pro wrestling growing up. I happened to grow up in Japan for much of my childhood. And so I knew pro wrestling mainly through Kinnikuman. That's where my first exposure to this concept of pro wrestling was. And of course, you know, as an American kid, I knew about Hulk Hogan. I knew about Macho Man Randy Savage. And then as I grew up, my friends were into WWF and WWE now. And so I was tangentially aware of all the other pro wrestlers that had come up during the so-called Attitude Era that you see photographed there. I was aware of it, but I would say that I wasn't necessarily interested or invested in it. And that interest and investment didn't come until about 2013. 2013, I came over to Japan to serve as a Mansfield Fellow. I was working in the Japanese government. I was living in Tokyo. Well, one night I was wandering around trying to find a place to eat for dinner. And I was in Meguro at the time. And so my wife and I were looking for a place, and then we spot this restaurant, and it's not like anything I've ever seen in Japan. It looks like this. And I'm wondering, what the heck is this place? What's with all the pro wrestlers on this awning here? And I looked at the name, and it said, Libera Steaky, Libera Steakhouse. And I'm wondering, what the heck is this? Now, we didn't end up going in there to eat that night. We went somewhere else. And but the idea of this restaurant stuck in my head. I couldn't get it out of my head and wondering, what the heck is this place? So like anybody else, when you have something banging around the old noggin and you want to find out more about it, I got home and I went on Google. I started searching into it. And I fell down this deep, deep rabbit hole, which is the relationship between US and Japan in this realm of pro wrestling. You know, here I was a Mansfield Fellow, and I'm supposed to be there about working on U.S.-Japan relations, and there's this subculture, this subset of that relationship I had no idea about. And it come to find out that Ebeda Steakhouse was this mecca for U.S. pro wrestlers who were in Japan. It was almost a rite of passage. You had to eat there, and even more, you had to get the Ebeda Steakhouse jacket. And if you can see, and this is what it looks like, it's floating in the middle of the ring here. The coveted Ribera Steakhouse jacket. So now I'm interested. Okay, I'm interested in U.S.-Japan relations. There's this unique relationship that exists within the pro wrestling world. So now I want to find out more about it. Then about a month after that, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, took me to this place called Antonio Inoki Sakaba. And it's unfortunate. It's no longer open. They had a big restaurant in Shinjuku. Then they moved to a smaller place, and now it's not open. But I'll tell you, if you had a chance to go, this place was incredible. You walk in, and there's this big statue of this guy named Antonio Inoki. His pictures are all over the wall. They only play one song in that restaurant on loop. Inoki's theme song, Inoki Bombaye, just over and over and over again. The middle of the restaurant is set up to look like a wrestling ring. And I was intrigued by this place. I'd never been to a restaurant like this in Japan. I mean, you get theme restaurants now, but this was 2013. Theme restaurants are just kind of starting to be a thing. And to have a place that was focused on just one person like this, I just thought it was intriguing to me. But then, like a couple of weeks after I went to this restaurant, I found that this guy, Antonio Inoki, had been censured by the House of Counselors. So, what are they doing censoring a pro wrestler? Well, he wasn't a pro wrestler at the time. He was a member of the House of Counselors, and he was censured because he went to North Korea without permission to go there. I got a lot of trouble with it inside the National Diet. Well, I'm focused on Northeast Asian security, the issues with North Korea and Japan, and so now I'm not just interested. Now I'm invested. And so I started asking questions about it. How would a pro wrestler get to be a politician? What is it that led to these circumstances? What are the relationship between pro wrestling and politics? And so I started doing research into it. And to understand it, we really got to go back in time, all the way back to the Allied occupation. So after Japan surrendered in World War II, hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers went to Japan to be part of the occupation force. And it oversaw the administration of the country through the general headquarters of the occupation led by General Douglas MacArthur. Now, the occupation lasted 7 years. So 7 years of GHQ oversight and administration. Now, it was a period in this occupation era of rebirth for Japan, a period of reconstruction and a reimagining of Japan as a liberal democracy. But there were other consequences too. And one consequence is while it was a period of rebirth, it was also a period of defeat for many. It was a period viewed as subjugation or a loss of identity for many Japanese. Now, another consequence that happened was that because of the number of American soldiers in Japan, it was also an influx of Americana. A lot of pop culture got injected into Japan during that period, whether it was through the Armed Forces Radio Network, was it through USO tours with concerts and sports exhibitions. And one of the things that happened to come over during that period of occupation was pro wrestling. Now, after the occupation ended, there was a company that formed. It was called the Japan Pro Wrestling Alliance. And in 1953, a year after the occupation ended, they started having shows. Now, perhaps Japan Pro Wrestling Alliance subverted expectations, because when people went there, they might have thought, well, it's just going to be a bunch of big burly Americans beating up on each other. But that wasn't the case. And perhaps they couldn't have expected what they were going to see. Instead of just a couple of big burly Americans having at it, they saw a former sumo rikishi turned pro wrestler beating down on these American giants. There was a man named Miki Dozan. Literally, the name means the strength to move mountains. He had this powerful finishing move they called the karate chop, and he would chop down these behemoths. And no matter how much pain he endured, no matter how much suffering he took in the ring, he would ultimately prevail. Now, this captured a massive audience during that time. As I mentioned, during the occupation, there was this undercurrent of defeat or subjugation among many, and they're curious about this identity they would have as Japanese in the post-war era. And Miki Dozan became a symbol for what they could be, a symbol of post-war strength. And to say that he had a rapt audience is an understatement. And let me put this in context for you. These pictures show an audience in Shimbashi Square. So if you've ever been to Shimbashi Station, you know that there's a big promenade or square outside the station. And you can see in the left photo there's this small TV set, okay? And all these people are gathered around to watch on this small TV set, Miki Dozan fighting his opponents. Miki Dozan, it cannot be overstated how important he was during this period, and his superstardom grew very, very quickly. So Miki Dozan became not just a pro wrestler, he became, as the founder and the executor for New Japan Pro Wrestling Alliance, he also was a businessman, and he started venturing into other business ventures. And he realized that he was building an empire. To do this, to sustain that empire, he needed proteges. And he would find one protege in perhaps the most unlikely of locations in Brazil. Now, for many, you may realize and might know that there was quite a big Japanese diaspora in Brazil. And when Rikidozan went over there, he had encountered a young man who was performing in a track exhibition. He was dominating everybody in shot put, javelin, and discus. And this young man, his family had come over during the immediate post-war years. His father had passed away, and his family had fallen on hard times. So they thought maybe they could find a way to earn a living over in Brazil. Well, Rikidozan saw this athlete, gifted, talented athlete, said, this guy's in the wrong sport. He needs to be in a different profession. And so Rikidozan ended up bringing him back to Japan and making him his protege. For this young man named Kanji Inoki, later Antonio Inoki, Rikidozan was sort of a surrogate father for him and was his mentor in the pro wrestling and business world. Now, unfortunately, that relationship would not last very long. You see, Rikidozan had his vices, and two of his vices was he loved going to nightclubs and he loved picking fights. And one night he happened to pick a fight with the wrong person. It was a young Yakuza Chimpira, little gangster who had taken a knife out and stabbed him in the stomach. Now, Rikidozan walked away from that, but he later died of complications from that wounds. And there's many different versions of the story about what caused him to finally die, but ultimately he passed away. And when that happened, it was a tragic event for many. And in this picture, I think illustrates this. This is the funeral procession from 1963 for Rikidozan. And many wondered, well, with Rikidozan gone, what would happen to pro wrestling? But he was wise. He had already nurtured a young protege. And with the death of Rikidozan came the rise of Antonio Inoki. Antonio Inoki became a superstar in his own right. And he would later wrestle with folks like Hulk Hogan. He would have a mixed martial arts match with Muhammad Ali, of all people, in the Budokan. And he would even find himself in The Bad News Bears Goes to Japan. So Inoki had become a superstar. He was a megastar in Japan. He was an international star for those who were aware of the pro wrestling world in Japan. And eventually he decided that he was going to parlay his business interests and his popularity into something different, into a new calling. And that new calling was politics. So just as Rikidozan had blazed the trail for Inoki in the world of pro wrestling and business, Inoki had opened the door for other pro wrestlers to enter the political world. Now, Inoki did it by entering the House of Councilors in 1989, but others would follow him. And so we now start to see a merging of these two worlds, the pro wrestling world and the political world in Japan. And there have been other notable politicians who have originated from that pro wrestling world. Some of them featured here. Some of them have been at the local levels, the prefectural levels, but then perhaps one of the most interesting examples of this is Hiroshi Hase, who was a diet politician. He ended up becoming a cabinet minister, and he's currently serving as the governor of Ishikawa Prefecture. So let's ask ourselves, how does this happen? How does somebody go from being a pro wrestler to becoming a politician? Well, I think we need to look at how anybody becomes a politician in Japan. So let's break it down. There's certain requirements that have to be met, of course, and those important requirements are listed here. They have to meet the age requirement. They have to be residents in the certain district that they're running for the seat in. They have to pay an election deposit before they're able to run in their campaign. And then they have to succeed during an excessively short campaign period. When I say campaign period is short, we're talking typically less than 30 days. For those of you who've been following the news right now, we know that Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba is getting ready to dissolve the lower house on the 9th of October for a 27 October vote. So that's a very, very short campaign period where somebody has to be able to succeed. Now, the requirements for all these do differ at the different levels that you see there. So the municipal assemblies have different requirements than anybody's running for mayor, et cetera, et cetera. But I'd like to go ahead and go through some of those requirements now, because it's something that's always good for me to refresh, but I think it's very interesting. So for the municipal assemblies, you have to be at least 25 years old. You have to have lived in that municipality for at least 3 months. And you have to deposit 300,000 yen just to be able to run in the election. Now, it's a deposit. Theoretically, you could get the money back. To get the money back, though, you have to gain a certain number of votes. If you don't reach that cap, then the money just goes to the municipality or whatever level that you're applying to elect for. Now, to become a mayor, that the deposit jumps up to 500,000 yen for towns and villages, 1 million yen if you're running for a city mayor. And if you're running for a big city like Kobe or Osaka, it's 2.4 million yen. If you're going to run for the prefectural assembly, it's 600,000 yen deposit. To be the governor of a prefecture, it's a 3 million yen deposit. And that's the same deposit that's required to run for the national diet. That's no small amount of money for an individual candidate to come up with just to pay for the election diet, or excuse me, the election deposit, especially with no guarantee that you're going to get it back. So given these requirements, what we see is that there's generally certain sources of success, and I break those down to four. A successful candidate to become a politician in Japan needs to be able to capitalize on the need for political parties to find viable candidates. They also need to have a base of support. So they need something already in place to be able to ensure that they can win the election. They also have to be comfortable performing in front of an audience. And then finally, they have to have strong business relationships. So let's break this down a little bit. This idea of needing to fill seats is very important because in a parliamentary system, if you want to affect outcomes, you need to have a majority of that parliament to be able to do so. If you want to control the diet and have the prime minister be from your party, you have to have the majority. So you have to find candidates who are able to win. Now, this creates a unique dynamic in the upper house, particularly the House of Councilors. In the upper house, the political parties will generally find people who are not necessarily career politicians, but people who are very popular. And so you actually see Terebi Taranto, the TV personalities or athletes who get elected into the upper house. And we see a very recent example here. The new Minister for Child Policy, Junko Mihara, started off as an actress, a singer, and a race car driver. And now she's a cabinet minister. But at the lower levels, we also see a unique dynamic here too. At the national level, it's definitely about making sure that you have the right candidates to fill your party. At the lower levels, though, sometimes it's about backing candidates who will support your policies. And what we see is something called kakuto ainori, something where multiple parties will back a single candidate. So if you're a very popular candidate at a local level, you might get the Jiminto, the LDP, and the CDP both backing you because you have enough overlapping policies that they want you on their side, and you have enough support base within that area to be able to succeed in those elections. Now, the second category here is support bases. Now, there's something very interesting and unique in Japanese politics that I'd like to share with you. It's this concept called koenkai. So rather than being a special interest group that is focused on policy preferences that then just picks its candidates that it likes, koenkai actually focus more on a single candidate or a group of candidates that they like. And this koenkai is basically just driving this person forward to win these elections. And this is something that grew up in the era of the post-war Japan and is most prominently featured in something called the Etsuzankai with former Prime Minister Kakuei Tanaka. To illustrate just how important Etsuzankai was for Kakuei Tanaka, that's where he built his empire upon in Niigata Prefecture. That's how he was able to become so powerful as a politician. And what was the benefits that the Etsuzankai got from it? Well, first of all, they had the prominence, the feature that their candidate was the one who is now elevated in power. But it was one of those things in Niigata Prefecture. If you were living in town in Niigata and you had your stoplight out and you wanted your stoplight fixed, you wouldn't go to the local council to say, please fix my stoplight. You want to go to the city hall. You would go to the Etsuzankai and say, hey, my shingo, my traffic light is not working. I would like somebody to fix it. Etsuzankai would reach out through its political channels up to Kakuei Tanaka, who would then use his levers of political power to make sure that stuff gets fixed. So it's a very unique system that exists in Japan. It is decreased in prominence, but having that support base, again, based on the way that the electoral systems work, is very important. Now, the next thing here, the need to have ability to perform in front of audiences. There are very performative aspects of politics anywhere in the world, but there's some unique elements here in Japan. So first is that stump speeches are still very much a thing. So for those of you who are still in Japan, you're going to see these around town and your respective areas, because with the election going to come up at the end of October, you're going to see the candidates out stumping. It's a very common thing, but that is a very performative aspect of trying to gain support. In fact, for those of you who can remember the assassination of Shinzo Abe, that happened when he was stumping for a fellow candidate during the upper house election a few years ago. Then there's also something called interpellations, which is where in the die, politicians have the opportunity to ask questions of cabinet ministers. So the performative aspect here is not only for the person asking the questions and presenting information to challenge the cabinet ministers, it's for the cabinet ministers to be able to respond to it. And so while you don't have to be an actor to be successful there, you at least have to be able to credibly read talking points and succeed if you want to elevate yourself in the public eye through interpellations. And then finally, there's business relations. Of course, there's the necessity to have financial support. With those very high deposits that's required, you want to make sure that you have the funds able to run for office. And then also because the external influence that comes from the business relationships, having these businesses who can extend your reach into the private sector, all are very important. With all these factors in mind, you can see that there's a relatively natural transition from the world of pro wrestling to politics. And why is that? Because wrestlers already generally have some popularity. They may be household names, certainly with the case of Antonio Inoki and Hiroshi Hase. They were already known across the country before they ran for office. You also have a ready-made support base. Many of these wrestlers have their fan groups that are already there supporting. They go to all their matches. They have online forums where they support these individuals. So when they transition to the political world, it's now not just about pro wrestling. Now it's support for their politics as well. The third factor, well, they have experience in front of crowds. And I mean, if you can cut a promo in your underwear on live TV, you can read a couple talking points in an assembly hall. And so very natural transition for many of these pro wrestlers. And then finally, wrestling is a business. At the end of the day, pro wrestling has to sell tickets. So they have media relations, they have experience with advertising, logistics, merchandising, all those things, all those business relationships are in place. And so they already have that relationship and that knowledge. And so this creates this merging of the worlds that I just talked about. I do want to get to the Q&A. So we can dive into some of these topics a little bit further, but I would like to offer a little bit more about the story of pro wrestling and the relationship with Japan, because it's so woven into the socio-political fabric here, more than I ever realized before. And to go back to this, I want to go back to Rikidozan, because unlike many wrestlers, Rikidozan's backstory was actually true. I mentioned that he was a sumo rikishi turned pro wrestler. That was his storyline while he was a sumo rikishi. He had participated in 23 grand sumo tournaments before the war, and he actually reached the rank of sekiwake. Now, what he didn't say was the full story, because it wasn't just that he was a sumo rikishi. He was actually Korean. He was born in South Hamgyong province, which is now part of DPRK. And so he was ethnic Korean. He had immigrated to Japan, and he entered a sumo stable, which is where he ended up rising in the ranks. Now, there was a glass ceiling for him. In the sumo world, they knew about his background. And so when you get into the sumo world, you can reach the rank of sekiwake through your performance. But to reach the ranks of ozeki or yokozuna, there's a committee that has to choose who is eligible and worthy of reaching those ranks. And so Rikidozan, as competent and strong as a sumo wrestler he was, knew that he was never going to get to that point. So he switched from the dohyo to the pro wrestling ring. And that's how he ended up becoming the symbol of Japanese post-war strength. Now, of course, little did people know at the time that he was ethnic Korean. He didn't advertise that fact. But what he would do during his time, his prominence, he would actually go over to Niigata Prefecture for vacations. Now, everybody thought he was just hanging out in some ryokan there in Niigata, but what he was actually doing was catching a ferry, and he was heading back to the DPRK. And if you read any of Antonio Inoki's memoirs, he writes about this, that Rikidozan would disappear for a couple of days, and he didn't even know where he was going. And he only later found out that Rikidozan was going to go visit family back in the DPRK. An interesting little piece of trivia about these ferries. They actually were relatively commonplace. The ferries, the maritime transit between Niigata and South Hamgyong province was going on up until 2006. 2006 was when the Japanese government finally imposed unilateral sanctions and stopped the maritime transit between those two areas. But that's how Rikidozan went back and forth during that time. So Rikidozan, because of his Korean ethnicity, his background, when people found out that he was actually born in South Hamgyong province, he actually became not just the hero to Japan, he was co-opted in DPRK vernacular too, in their narratives. And so Rikidozan or Ryokdo-san was somebody who is venerated for a short period of time in the DPRK as well. And you can see the books, the manga, the comics that were written about him. They were translated in English, and they even had commemorative stamps that were issued related to him. Now, why does this matter? It wasn't just because of the fact that there was a socio-political connection, the implications for DPRK-Japan relations. It's because this had a huge impact on Inoki, who, when he became a politician, what he really wanted to focus on was breaking through barriers and seemingly intractable problems. And he did that through something called his concept of fighting spirit diplomacy, or what he called Tokon Gaiko. And this notion was that he would use sports to try to provide opportunities for engagement where engagement might not be possible. And that was so much a part of his political ideology that when he first became a politician in 1989, he did it through his own political party, the Sports Heiwato, or the Peace and Sports Party. But this is something that he continually worked through in his career, and he demonstrated through several actions. So he gets elected in the House of Councilors in 1989. And then 1991, Iraq invades Kuwait. And when they do that, they take all of the Japanese, well, foreign residents that were in Kuwait, and they forcibly move them to Baghdad. And they hold all the diplomats and the business people there in the hotel in Baghdad, basically as de facto hostages. Now, at the time, the Japanese government was trying to get the release of these Japanese citizens from Baghdad, but they were frustrated. They couldn't get anything going. And so Inoki says, you know what? I'm going to go over there. I'm going to do something. And against the Japanese government's recommendations, he went to Baghdad and he negotiated a 2-day sports and music festival. And when he did that, he said, well, I'm going to bring some of the Japanese families of the people who were there in Baghdad. I'm going to bring them over here, and I'm going to talk to the Iraqi officials and say, the families are here. Why don't you let them all go back together? And so by doing so, Inoki was actually able to secure the release of 241 Japanese citizens at the conclusion of that Sports and Peace Festival. And that was a testament to his sports diplomacy efforts. And the other thing it did was it opened the door, because right after that, you know, Saddam Hussein had already released 241 citizens. What's a few more? The Japanese government was able to get the release of the rest of them. Now, he liked this idea so much, he was going to keep doing it. And so in the mid-90s, you had another country that was problematic for Japan, and that was North Korea. So 1993 to 94, you have the North Korean nuclear crisis. It was North Korea declared that we're going to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There was this concern about the advent of nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula, tensions between Japan and North Korea. And Inoki says, you know what, my mentor, my surrogate father, Rikidozan, he's North Korean. There's no reason why Japan and North Korea should be hating each other so much. And so he says, I'm going to go over there and create an event to try to create linkages and interpersonal contact to reduce these tensions. And so he works with WCW. And for many who knows, WCW, very big wrestling promotion in the mid-90s. They're actually bigger than the WWF at one point. He says, I'm going to help you get the biggest event in the world. We're going to do it in North Korea. And sure enough, Antonio Inoki manages to get Pyongyang to accept that they're going to do this big event in the May Day Stadium in Pyongyang in 1995. And so he goes with all these American wrestlers, Japanese wrestlers, to Pyongyang to have what they call the collision in Korea. And if you're interested, you can actually go on YouTube. The whole thing is there. You can watch the whole pay-per-view that they produced based on that. And yes, in that upper right photo, you can see Muhammad Ali that actually traveled with them to Pyongyang for this event. Now, unfortunately, it didn't have any traction. It didn't actually do anything to change the nature of the relationship between Japan and the DPRK. But Inoki didn't stop trying. he continually went through. And I think before his time as a politician was done, he had traveled to the DPRK nearly 40 times to try to get something to shake loose in the relationship between the two countries. The last time he had a big event there was actually as recently as 2014. He once again had another peace and sports event in North Korea to try to ensure that he could maybe make some sort of relationship with the new Kim Jong-un regime. And although he didn't have any success in this, it was something he maintained, a passion he maintained until the day he passed away just a few years ago. So I guess the question now is, what's the legacy? Are we going to see more pro wrestlers who turn to the world of politics? Is this something we're going to see somebody like Antonio Inoki who can use sports diplomacy and wrestling as a means to try to achieve foreign policy objectives? We don't know. We really don't know where this is going to go, but we do know that there was a lot of effort put into this point, and they sure put on one heck of a show. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and open up to Q&A and say thank you for your time and attention.
All right, great presentation. I'm sure there's a lot more we can build on that. We've got some folks in the chat that are noticing your scarf. I see some nice scarf comments in the chat there. We're still building up some questions. There's a lot of time still left for Q&A, so I encourage everyone to please leave your questions related to the talk in the Q&A, and we'll get to them. There was a few comments. So I guess maybe some comments I wonder maybe you can touch on a little bit more. So we had questions about Inoki, Nikkei Nisei from question marks. Obviously, you kind of touched upon Ricky Dozon kind of ran across Inoki in Brazil. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Is there anything more that you can plumb about those roots of Inoki?
Yeah, so Inoki was actually born and raised in Yokohama, but after the war, his father had passed away, and so his family needed to find some way to survive, and so that's why they decided to immigrate to Brazil. And it wasn't until the 50s that Riki Dozon found him there. But that's why, his birth name Kanji Inoki, he adopts Antonio Inoki based on his time in Brazil.
Very good. Thank you. Yeah, that question, by the way, that comment was by Fawn Shin. Thank you, Fawn. He also commented about Ricky Dozon. Rest in peace to both Inoki and Ricky Dozon, hailing from the peninsula, which I feel that you covered quite enough. So I'm not going to ask you to retouch that exactly. But very, very wonderful. Amani had a question about more of the politics side. So you mentioned in passing interpolations. And she asked, are interpolations like public open interviews in front of the Diet? And I was wondering, could you go into a little bit more about what those are as well? Because I'm
absolutely
curious.
This is great. So I'll give you a little bit of the mechanics of it, and then I've got a great Inoki story for you on interpolations, because a lot of people were like, oh, this pro wrestler, he's such a dolt and asking these types of questions there. Okay, so interpolations. So if you look at the U.S. political system, we have like congressional hearings, and you would have it'd be broadcast on C-SPAN, and only policy wonks and nerds like me watch C-SPAN, right? So, but the interpolations in Japan, these are committee meetings where you could have like a budget committee or a national security and foreign policy committee, but really the questions are whatever you want to ask. It's open questions. So somebody will use that to ask a question about a scandal or ask about a different policy that's near and dear to their heart. And so this question, the politician will go up to the podium. They get a certain amount of time to ask these questions to the cabinet ministers. The cabinet ministers will come up and they have to answer it. Now, here's the unique dynamic. Prior to 1994, the electoral reforms that happened, the politicians didn't actually have to answer the questions. The bureaucrats themselves could answer the question. So you would ask a question, and it would be a bureaucrat from Ministry of Finance or a Ministry of Foreign Affairs who would have to answer these policy questions. And so it'd be a lot easier. Politicians could get off the hook. But after these reforms happened, people said the politicians, the ministers should be speaking for themselves. And so what happens now is still the bureaucrats who are drafting the answers. There's the poor bureaucrats have to spend all night prepping the answers. and then making sure that they get those to the politicians to be able to read in the diet. And so the interpolations, I would say that the reason why they matter is because they are broadcast. You can watch them on TV. They are recapped in the newspapers. So if you read Tokyo Shimbun, they usually have a gist of the interpolations from the day before. It's a really good place to get an understanding of what the zeitgeist is inside the diet. And if you say something really silly or stupid, then it's going to get broadcast, and that could get you in hot water. So I use the example of there was a minister for cybersecurity, Yoshitaka Sakurada, who when he was in diet interpolations, they were asking about his experiences with computers, and he had to reveal that he actually doesn't know how to use a computer, which having a minister of cybersecurity who doesn't know how to use a computer, obviously that got him in very hot water. And then you had a minister for Northern Territories, the four Northern Territories, Habomai, Kunashiri, Chikotan, and I don't know why I'm forgetting the last one. But he forgot them. And he's the minister for Northern Territories. He couldn't remember the names of the islands. And there's only 4 island groups. So he ended up in hot water. So the interpolations do matter. And your ability to perform in that environment matters. It also matters for the people who are asking the questions, because if you want to build a name for yourself, if you can challenge the cabinet ministers or you can demonstrate your knowledge in these interpolations, it can build your stature. That's a long explanation of the mechanics. So I want to get into at least a very interesting story, because this one's kind of personal to me too. Because back when I was working at U.S. Forces Japan, I had a good buddy. He was one of the bureaucrats who had to write the answers for the politicians, right? And he was telling me about this one question he had to answer. And in the news, I had seen Antonio Inoki had gotten in a lot of hot water because he asked the question. He said, if Japan was invaded by aliens, how would the self-defense forces respond? And everybody's like, who's this idiot asking about, aliens from outer space invading Japan? And when I was talking to my buddy who had to write the response, he said, I loved it. It was the best question I ever had to write a response for, because I could be honest about the capabilities we have, the capabilities we need, because it wasn't tainted with China or North Korea. There wasn't any of the extra political considerations. I could just be honest about the things that we needed to focus on to support Japanese national defense. He's like, Inoki knew that. He said, I briefed Inoki and he understood what he was doing. So that's just a little anecdote there.
That's really interesting. Yeah, to be able to separate the politics of the situation and just look at it pure and simple capabilities
That's right.
conversation, right? Which I think is, as we see, and how all of our conversations get kind of colored by our biases, and to be able to take those away is actually probably a lot more beneficial than many of us think about. Wow, that's a really interesting. I might imagine being a professional wrestler and being used to cutting promos and things like this could be very useful in this interpolations kind of and shift of like the politicians having to answer as well. Uh, which
Absolutely.
which brings me to a question that we had. And I know you mentioned this, or at least in my eyes, I believe you mentioned, or maybe because I'm also a pro wrestling fan, I could see the natural connections. But we had a question from Hun Tran Hui, excuse me if my pronunciation is, I'm sure, atrocious, who asked, they have a question for you. When a professional wrestler enters the political path, what advantages and pressures do you think they will have compared to others?
Well, so it's interesting. One of the pressures they have sometimes is how do they transition their identity to the political
Mm.
world? And is even something very mechanical, such as if you wear a mask, how can you then wear that mask in the political world? And there was this big debate in multiple assembly level, prefectural level assemblies, because these guys would have masks that would cover their eyes. And they said that you aren't allowed to cover your eyes and wear a mask in the assembly. Well, that undercuts their identity. And
Mm.
so they had to compromise. They had to negotiate. So now they have masks that you can actually still see their eyes and their mouth. It's still the rest of the head is covered. I mean, that's a very simple thing. But the other thing that the stigma that comes around it is that because they're pro wrestlers, either they're fake or they are showmen. They're not legitimate in terms of their understanding of policies. And I think the anecdote I mentioned about Antonio Inoki was very salient. Inoki was on the National Defense and Foreign Policy Committee, and he was very interested and invested, but nobody took him seriously in the political world. They're like, Inoki, what does he know about foreign policy and defense? Well, this is the guy who went to Baghdad and went and negotiated with the Iraqi government. He actually knew more than I would say the average politician. But because he was a pro wrestler, he had that stigma. So fighting that stigma is a huge hurdle for many of these people who are trying to transition. And keep in mind, I mean, many of these pro wrestlers are very successful businessmen in their own right, businessmen or women. They know how to manage finances. So they're capable, but because they run around in their underwear and throw each other into the turnbuckles, people don't trust them.
Yeah, I definitely feel that answer there. It's really interesting because you mentioned earlier how we had government ministers in charge of Northern Territories who didn't know the Northern Territories.
Yeah,
And then that particular, to see that those same people would question the knowledge base of someone else who's had such strong, obvious successes.
yeah.
That the Baghdad hostage negotiations is really amazing when you think about it. Like, it probably is one of the bigger foreign policy wins or diplomacy wins that Japan's had, right? I mean, that is amazing. So I did after that, was there still a questioning of his ability, or did that help to change some of the, like, I mean, he had to come back, his scarf flowing in the wind with feeling like the champion of the world after that, I imagine.
One of the stigmas with sports diplomacy and any foreign policy engagement is that if you engage with a government that's adversarial in a way that doesn't look like you're demonstrating strength, in a way that looks conciliatory or friendly, then it's almost viewed as you're legitimizing the adversarial government or that you're
Kowtowing.
kowtowing to them. And I think that was the impression at the time that here you have Iraq had invaded Kuwait, had violated the rules-based international order, and you have Inoki going to set up a sports and music festival. Well, shouldn't he be sanctioning them? Or shouldn't he be denouncing them? And he's having outreach to them. But I think what Inoki's view was that there's always going to be conflict, there's always going to be tension, but you need to have an off ramp to that conflict and tension.
That's very wise for someone who took a lot of bumps, I'm sure, in their career.
Yeah.
Uh, so you mentioning the sports diplomacy brings me up. We had a question from Amani, and she asked, in your opinion, how important is that sports diplomacy for foreign policy within the Indo-Pacific? And do you think it could be impactful in the current state of affairs?
There are limitations to sports diplomacy. Obviously, you have to be very concerned about the legitimizing of a government that shouldn't be delegitimized. I think about the fact that it was, Hitler used the Olympics to help elevate the status of Germany and the Nazi Party. There's still pictures you can see of the swastika in the background, and that's part of that Olympic history now. But you have to balance that because, again, if you don't have mechanisms for engagement or you need to open doors to engagement, sometimes sports is the way to do it. So where governments may not be willing to talk to each other for whatever reason, maybe the sports channel is something that can open it up. I use the example of DPRK in Japan. Recently, we had the DPRK soccer team, and it was in March, I think it was. They came over to do a World Cup qualifier in Tokyo. And the Japanese team was supposed to go back to Pyongyang and do another World Cup qualifier there. And Japan was getting ready to send about 14 government officials with that team on the hopes that they'd be able to get some sort of engagement. Now that fell through, but at least they had that opportunity, an opportunity that wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for the sports that was there. So sports diplomacy is not an end of itself. It's not something that's going to produce these massive effects, but it's a tool. And you can't forget that you have this tool in your toolkit and you should use it when you can.
Yeah, actually, in a kind of a side caveat to that, thinking about this sports diplomacy and professional wrestling and its use in that, it reminds me of recently Saudi Arabia has been making a lot of pushes and trying to raise their, I guess, their soft power image. They've been doing a lot with having WWE events in Saudi Arabia. They've been like buying F1 teams and they've been trying to put a lot into this sports diplomacy thing. I wonder if Inoki's vision more firmly rooted itself in the Saudi leadership than the Japanese leadership. And again, they have a lot of money to use. So
That's right.
yeah. Um, but you mentioned North Korea in your previous answer, and that brings me to a question that we had from Gen Nurui, who asks, why do you think that the government of North Korea welcomed Inoki and Ric Flair and American wrestlers to have a show in North Korea? So we talked a little bit about Inoki's like view and his mindset, but why would North Korea allow this? What do you feel their side was, or goal, if you
With
will?
North Korea, you can never pinpoint one single thing. You have to base it on a range of options and figure out which option is most likely. So let's think about the potential options here. Option one, mid 1990s was when the famine was beginning in North Korea, and maybe the government wanted to be able to highlight that they had things under control and have this event in Pyongyang to signal that. That's option one. Option two, brand new, Kim Jong Un or Kim Jong Il, Kim Jong Un's father, had just taken over in 1994. So it was a period of government transition. So it's possible that they said, well, we want to legitimize the new government by showing that there's these other countries who are coming to Pyongyang. They're visiting us over here. Option three, North Korea really wanted to try to advance normalized relations. You had this period of crisis from 1993 to 94, and they wanted an off ramp. They thought that maybe having a sports festival that included Japanese and US athletes would be something to decrease the tensions and show that they're not on a path to war. So if you look at those range of options, it could be a mix of those. I wasn't there, I wasn't around looking at this stuff in the mid '90s, so it's harder for me to project what I think would be the answer. But if it was today, I would say that they would use sports diplomacy mainly because they want to create a new paradigm of recognition and a restructuring of partnerships.
Very good. Thank you for that. So this is kind of, so now we're gonna shift. I'm shifting to some more fun kind of questions that we have that both myself and from the audience that maybe it's interesting. So we had a question from Patricia, and I have someone I know of, but I'm curious if you know of any. Patricia asked, are there any former pro wrestlers or current turned politician today?
Yeah. So Hiroshi Hase is the best example of that, the governor of Ishikawa. So he was the minister for the Olympics back in 2013, or whenever it was. He was part of the Olympic Committee, working with Shinzo Abe in 2013 to get the Tokyo Olympics. He ended up becoming the minister of the Olympics at some point between 2013 and 20, and then he transitioned to become the governor. I think there's a couple at the prefectural level. I can't remember their names, but there are a couple of the mask wearing guys I think it's in Nagano and Oita. The Oita politician is actually part of the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan, so he's part of the opposition, but he's at the prefectural level.
Yeah. Also, another that I know of a smaller level, in the house, or what is it? She's the Matsuyama. She's part of
Yeah.
Matsuyama City Councilor, I guess.
There you
Uh,
go.
Her name is Arina Tanaka, and
Yeah.
she's the owner of Ehime Pro Wrestling.
There you go.
And she also wrestles as the mascot and wrestler, Ellie. Cutie Ellie, I think is her character name, and she's a masked wrestler.
Yes.
Yeah, so there are definitely up and down from local level and higher, which
Yeah.
is really interesting. Have you had speaking of those local level, those smaller level, have you looked into seeing how, we've talked about in this conversation pro wrestling and diplomacy and how things work internationally and all these great major accomplishments and major figures. Uh, do you know much about how these pro wrestling organizations impact their local constituents and how these lower levels and what some of them are doing, or is that a bit outside of your wheelhouse?
I only speak to what I know from my experience at the local levels in Niigata, and the anybody who has a support base, whether it's a Koenkai or a fan base, what they typically do is they leverage that capability for community events, whether it's festivals, whether it's rebuilding, reconstruction, or other projects in the local community, that's where you would normally see it. So with some of the local professional wrestlers, that's what you see them leveraging their influence to try to benefit the local communities.
Yeah, it's that matches up with what I've seen as well. But I think it's really interesting to think because I think in those rural communities, those little small things like having the wrestlers, it's maybe I'm going off on a tangent here, but it's quite interesting to see because I know they'll have things like with Ehime Pro Wrestling, one of the expectations for the pro wrestlers is being kind of like a model citizen and to
Oh
do
yeah,
things and to go and like so the wrestlers will go and they will help out at the retirement homes with the
yeah,
older people and it's
yeah.
like this vision of like how to be a proper
Yeah,
Japanese.
it is really interesting with the uniqueness in Japanese pro wrestling because they are probably the most polite people that you will ever meet. Just respectful, and when they're outside of the ring, just the nicest people. But then when in the ring, they have their crazy personas and they adopt the characters they need to adopt.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. But I think it's important to mention the because I think a lot of us casually don't realize uh how great of citizens they can be.
Yeah,
Um but yeah, so I am also since we're talking about pro wrestlers going into politics, I think it's also worth mentioning obviously we saw during Governor Koike's reelection campaign she herself got involved in wrestling. So we now have politicians coming into wrestling. And I think for many people to see that, like, I mean, even BBC and others were covering it. And I think for many people, they would say, why the heck would the governor of Tokyo go get involved with, like, not only did she start the event, but she literally got involved in the match and giving a chop
yeah,
to Minoru Suzuki during the
yeah,
match.
yeah.
So why do you think that is? Like, can you explain a little bit of like, I mean, there must be a strong connection still if Governor Koike is going to do something like that.
Well, the that's why I spent so much of this presentation talking about the history of it and the impact that Nikki had on Japanese society at the time and how Japanese pro wrestling, in the States, you kind of look at pro wrestling as kind of a gimmick. It's very niche in terms of some of the types. There's a lot of stereotypes in terms of people who might be a big pro wrestling fan. At least certainly where I was growing up, that was the sentiment. But in Japan, it's not the same thing. Like you said, pro wrestlers are viewed as model citizens that are also entertainers. And you had this very strong connection with pro wrestling during the post-war era that the older generations in Japan still venerate. They still have those memories of that. And so I think there's a different level of respect for pro wrestling and its place in society that exists in Japan than it does in other areas. And so it's easier for a politician to do something that not look absurd. Certainly, they might look absurd to foreign audiences, but not within a domestic context.
So another interesting, fun kind of topic since we're talking about it. So we talked about previous and current. Are there any, this maybe myself being a bit of a nerd, are there any particular pro wrestlers, current pro wrestlers or people attached to the industry that you feel could make that jump in the future from pro wrestling to politics? We've
Yeah.
talked about, various like skill sets that they have. Do you feel that was this like a rarity to have someone like Inoki, or are there any current day people that you feel could make that jump?
You probably have a better read on the people than I do. Here's what I'll tell you is it from my vantage point with the LDP, it's probably gonna be a lot harder for any pro wrestler to go in there. Hiroshi Hase, I think, was a very unique example. But you have these opposition parties that need to run candidates against the LDP. I think that you have they're going to be searching for candidates. So if there's anybody who is interested in making that transition, now is the time. The CDP is still soul searching, trying to find where they're going to go. You got the Nippon Inokai and all these opposition parties that want to challenge the LDP. If they want to succeed, again, pro wrestlers have that ready-made skill set, the relationships, the popularity, the fan bases that make that natural transition. So I don't know who the people would be, but I would say the time is ripe right now.
Yeah, we have seen a growth right now with the pro wrestling industry currently the way it is. Like there's a lot of you've been seeing like in the pandemic, there was quite a lot of shifts that a lot of the Japanese pro wrestling companies had to do with no audiences. And so they were doing like arena shows with no fans, and then they shifted eventually to having to socially separate people. So like they would have one seat, then they would have tape X across the next seat, then one seat. And they did very well at adjusting these. I feel bad for the younger pro wrestlers who probably had to run through those big arenas and manually put tape between every other
Yeah.
seat. But
Yeah.
one of the other side effects of that has been a large growth in Japanese pro wrestling audience internationally, and
Mhm.
and a feeling of even more internationalization of Japanese pro wrestling. Maybe
Yeah.
not to the levels that they were at in the 80s and 90s, but certainly much stronger than in the 90s and the 2000s, where Japanese pro wrestling has become something that is getting a lot more attention internationally. So
Mhm.
some of the names are getting bigger and bigger, even worldwide.
Yeah.
So names like Kazuchika Okada was
Mhm.
a big name in Shin Nihon, New Japan Pro Wrestling,
Mhm.
who's now wrestling in America under the AEW wrestling
Mhm.
banner.
Yep.
In chat, we had Patricia, one of our YCAPS member, who used to have her personal trainer, was a DDT wrestler named Michael Nakazawa, who also wrestles in America now for that same organization. So you have been seeing a lot of Japanese wrestlers going abroad and a lot more attention being on Japan. So you never know. It is possible that one of these major names could come back after this like success abroad to come back and have that national pride into them again. You've
Yeah.
got Hiroshi Tanahashi is a major name who's moved from wrestler into now he is the president of New Japan Pro Wrestling. And he is constantly, of course, echoing Inoki. Speaking of
Mhm.
Inoki, I also want to mention we have the anniversary, 10/1. So the anniversary of Inoki's passing, I believe, was just 2 days ago. So I
Mhm.
think that also bears mentioning.
Mhm.
But that being said, we are a bit out of time. I
Yeah.
apologize. I want to say thank you to our great speaker today. Really wonderful topic, maybe my own personal nerdy topic. But I thought you did a very, very good job of showing a totally different side of Japanese culture and Japanese politics that most of us probably are not aware of. And I thought we got a lot of value out of that. So thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to help us with that.
Thank you for everybody joining, and thanks for hosting me, Jeff.
That being said, that's all we've got for today. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you again to our speaker. Thank you to Amani Kid, who was kind enough to let me step in today and be a terrible moderator. And thank you everyone in our audience for joining us today. It was a really great discussion. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
FadTech's IT support and mobile internet service helps make events like this one possible. Thank you.